Now, some people have billed Žižek as, the guy who's finally coming, sent by the left to put Peterson in his place once and for all, or whatever it is. But the damn crazy thing about this is that they almost completely agree with each other on the subject of the massive toxicity of modern political correctness.
That's why I always claim this. The secret target, although they don't admit it, of Me Too, or especially of political correctness, is the working class. Because they behave in this popular, vulgar way, like making slightly vulgar, although loving, erotic remarks to women, and so on and so on. And isn't it so sad? That's for me the biggest condemnation of Me Too. That what Oscar Wilde said? He wrote, I think, everything in life is about sex, except sex itself. Sex is about power. And that's what you see so clearly in Me Too. They talk about sex all the time, but it's not really about sex. For them, sex is only viewed through the prism of power. It's an instrument of power. And power at its worst. Why? Because even if they mostly have the right to complain against male domination, exploitation, their complaint, it's so clear, is not aimed at really helping people. Their complaint is about using your victimhood as a resource of your own power. They want power. One of the ways to acquire power in social relations is to present yourself as a victim. If you are a victim, you are beyond reproach, and whatever arguments you give against the person who claims to be a victim, you are in advance accused of brutalizing the victim, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that Me Too got too much impregnated with this brutal reality of American academic life in journalist circles, in these intellectual class circles, where it's all about power and career. And again, to proclaim yourself a victim is simply one of the ways to reassert your power.
Žižek's pointing this thing out, which is so obviously true from the outside and yet so taboo to point out. The idea that there's this kind of large conglomerate leftist culture in intellectual class circles, basically journalism, media, and academia, where they're all of a sudden transmuting their victim status into this extremely powerful political tool that they can use to even oppress people. And it's just so crazy to me that Žižek is so popular among so many leftists, and yet, if you were to take these ideas that he's talking about here and just sort of maybe naively go into, a leftist Reddit subreddit or leftist Facebook group, or maybe you meet some people at a party and just say kind of explicitly, I believe that despite the claims that are made about race and gender and their relationships with power and everything, there's this kind of obvious thing that's happening, which is that the very claims to victimhood are being abused as a way of asserting power over people. And it's just so obvious to me. And well, Jesus. We all know how that would go. But this is what I just don't fucking understand why it is that, he's allowed to go around saying this stuff, and leftists, they kind of push back a little bit, but mostly he's very tolerated. And I don't fucking get it. Okay, I don't fucking get it.
Also with political correctness, often the position of a victim can be used as a nice instrument to justify your exerting of, in academia, American, it's typical. In outside, victims are really victims. But in academia, playing with victimhood, if you're a privileged victim, gives you an incredible power, de facto.
So there's another thing, too. Peterson's often making this argument that Marxism in sort of the way that it manifests in our culture is very deeply corrupted by this need for like revenge or this intense like resentful hatred. And then he further points out that in the sort of modern manifestations of this bizarre kind of critical theory postmodern culture that we're getting out of academia nowadays, that you have this same reappearance of an intense need to really do evil shit to people who you feel oppressed by. And Žižek, I guess, basically agrees with this.
You can feel this in Me Too. A big pressure to take revenge. It's this voice of fury and revenge. And this is always bad. I even suspect that politically correct people, they don't really want to resolve the problem, because if the problem disappears, they would have to change radically. I see these politically correct protesters, how their whole identity is based on proclaiming yourself victim and blaming others and so on. If you take this away from them, they are a nobody, in a sense, no?
Now, I know he's already talked about how political correctness is actually a kind of intense attack on the working class because of the language requirements involved. And of course, we all see this in our personal lives and when we watch the media because of how it's this sort of saltiness of the language that somebody uses as opposed to the actual content of what they're saying that ends up becoming the thing that gets them pilloried and persecuted. And of course, this has a very disproportionate and unfair impact on people who just happen to use saltier language in general. And then, of course, this means that it has like a highly exclusionary impact on the working class. I think Tommy Robinson's experience with the media and kind of deplatforming is a big part of this because, oftentimes he'll talk about just like Muslims as opposed to saying, particularly Islamic extremists in the very specific way which people like Maajid Nawaz or Sam Harris will use, just because he's a kind of working class bloke and he doesn't always make the sort of like linguistic demarcations perfectly. And when people have asked him, I've seen Maajid Nawaz do this before, well, of course he'll agree to, say it's just Islamic extremists I'm talking about, whatever. He also echoes the same point that Peterson often makes about the Democratic Party and the sort of Hillary-style Democrats, where they become so obsessed with all of these varied identity categories that they completely stop caring about the working class. And I might even go so far as to say that there's something like weirdly intentional about it. I can't imagine Hillary Clinton wanting to have any real association or contact with ordinary working people or lower class people. But she can get all sort of feminist and identity politics and advocate for wealthy women CEOs and bankers and get that same sort of fuzzy feeling of advocacy without ever actually having to, associate with people who might be intellectually or culturally beneath her.
Segregated toilets, yes, wonderful. It's even better if you get support from all the big names like Tim Cook of Apple and so on, Microsoft, everything. I think that the tragedy of today's left is Hillary Clinton's politics. Nothing against.
Oh, well, that brings it. Sorry, I interrupted
No. That's the idea that you try to recuperate all these partial identity political progressive causes just to get rid of the real one of the economico-political change. And that's how Trump gets elected.
Strangely, the infamous Cathy Newman just doesn't challenge him at all and goes on to the next question, which is a very strange thing and something that I'm going to talk about later because it's a much broader general phenomenon, actually. So kind of after hearing Žižek speaking all of these quote-unquote reactionary talking points, I suppose it won't really become much of a surprise to people to then hear him talk about the bigotry of low expectations as a concept.
White people, at the same time, I noticed, have no problems behaving in a very patronizing way towards others, correcting them, telling them when they are making a mistake or whatever. So clearly, the secret profit is this moral authority given to you in this way. I think there is something of the same with how in Europe, and I have all sympathy for them, but nonetheless, how in Europe leftists, left liberals, behave towards immigrants. Of course, we should be, my God, my position is, do not be afraid, very leftist here. I just noticed how, in their very understanding of immigrants, how they always already patronize them. Like, if immigrants do, and like all people, they are a mixed crowd. There are criminals among them and so on. If they do something horrible, rape and so on, white liberals are always looking for an excuse. Oh, this is just general human nature, we are all like that, or they were so victimized by us, we should understand this, and so on and so on. And one of my immigrant friends exploded and told me that it's a beautiful paradox, philosophical. He told me, my God, my basic human right is at least to be recognized as an adult, responsible person, which practically means to be able to do something horrible. Are they aware that by treating me almost like a child in this way, they are humiliating me, and so on and so on?
So there you have it. Žižek seems to agree, very tightly with Peterson and really the rest of the IDW's take on the problem of political correctness. But despite this, Žižek really does see himself quite squarely as a political enemy of Peterson's, nonetheless.
Debate with Jordan Peterson.
I think, now he wants to do other debates. Yes, on 19th of April in Toronto. Now he wants to do it with me in London for BBC. I accepted only one, because, first he rhetorically is pretty good. Mm-hmm. So we made a precise deal. I set my conditions. First, it's not even a debate. There is a neutral moderator. We both checked that he is neutral. And the moderator introduces us, then each of us speaks for half an hour, presenting his theory case, not addressing each other, just presentation. Then each of us answers the other in 10 minutes, and then it's Q&A with the public. Because what I wanted to avoid is this lively exchange where maybe he is even better. He's very good at this Muslim style of, don't use this, Muslim style of, in the sense that he knows first, he gives you some 10 books, but you know that biological study proves this, proves that, and then he insists on that, and of course you don't know all those books, no? This is one, So I wanted to make it this neutral.
So despite the fact that so many people comment, all the internet commentators and people writing think pieces about this are thinking that, Žižek knows, Peterson doesn't know shit about philosophy, so Žižek's just going to destroy him or, wipe the floor with him or whatever. Meanwhile, I see on like the Peterson subreddits and so on, people kind of have like a much more balanced view. They're like, I think this is going to be very interesting. I look forward to their talk. And of course, contrary to the common like left-wing narrative or whatever, Žižek's here and he's like very explicitly saying that he made sure that the parameters of the debate were organized in a way that actually protects him from Peterson's genuinely high rhetorical skill. And this is kind of why I see people on the left as stupid, even though I know like objectively so often they're really, really intelligent, is that they can be so insistent on believing the canonical things that you have to believe as a leftist that they'll kind of convince themselves of anything. And so even a smart person can end up becoming quite stupid in this way. Like, how the hell did it happen that so many people became convinced not only that Peterson was like wrong and so fine you don't agree with him, but that he's an idiot somehow? And then of course you have Žižek here who's finally going to talk to him, and he's like, I'm actually, kind of concerned about the fact that Peterson's, very smart and good at arguing. It's like, yeah, well, of course he is. So, in this you can sort of start to see, Žižek kind of on principle opposing Peterson for his, like, maybe potentially conservative, non-social constructionist views of gender. But this is so strange for me because Žižek has his own kind of biological essentialist, if you will, arguments. I won't go into them now, but he has a lot to say about a specific kind of female hysteria as a phenomenon. So obviously he doesn't also think that the psychology between men and women is this fully socially constructed thing. And that's kind of reflective of most of Žižek's criticisms of Peterson, unfortunately, is that looks a lot more like a slightly more nuanced reiteration of the kind of lame think piece thought bubble that's formed around criticizing Peterson, which is so kind of shitty. So Žižek doesn't really believe that gender is a complete social construct. I guess he just believes that whatever it is that Peterson thinks about it, he disagrees with. Who knows? Now, I don't really have an extremely coherent take on this. I just wanted to share this phenomenon, which I think is very interesting, and then maybe give some thoughts in the end. I'm just going to show this one last clip where Žižek talks about his strategy for dealing with the debate.
My plan is to play Kennedy in that famous 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debate, not address him. You know why Kennedy won? Nixon was addressing Kennedy, your program, Democratic, we here, there. Kennedy looked into the camera and says, you American people, you are tough, we can, and I will try, because the reason I accepted it, one reason was also not to appear coward. He was challenging me and people were already saying, oh, are you afraid? The second reason is, it's more tricky, political. I want to address people who may be attracted by him, who are sick of stupidities of political correctness, and tell them something like, are you tired of stupidities of political correctness? Don't go to him, Peterson, vote Bernie Sanders. That's my message. Who is already now widely attacked. You know this. Didn't they publish me in Russia today? Yes. By text on...
They did, yes. They did.
No, Sanders' feminist attacks on him.
So I guess Žižek wants to talk to sort of people like me and suggest that maybe Bernie Sanders is the right answer to this political correctness problem, but honestly I don't see it even a little bit. Just because the left is eating itself and going after Bernie Sanders doesn't mean that Bernie Sanders actually presents some kind of solution or even an acknowledgement that political correctness might be a problem. And this kind of cheesy political gambit really makes me think that perhaps Žižek doesn't really see political correctness as being like an ideological problem in of itself as much as another impediment to his sort of leftist political project that he's interested in. Now that might sound a bit extreme, but with the massive emergence of the information economy and the concentration of all of our communication channels to these very few tech platforms, which seem to be almost completely ideologically uniform, and also the most important centers for political discourse in the modern world. Now, with that, and also the general intellectual advancement that we have in our universities and like the massive communication that happens in the media, I think it's time for these old Marxist baby boomers to wake up and realize that, well, information is now more important and more powerful than capital. And so we shouldn't be so narrowly concerned about like capitalist ideology as we should be concerned about ideology proper. To me, that's where the really interesting conversation would be. Not this sort of Marxism versus capitalism argument, but maybe a real sober discussion about the state of ideology in the world today. Because Žižek has talked about the Soviet Union and Mao's China and is also extremely critical of of course he's acknowledging how horrible it is. So it's not as though he doesn't realize that capitalism isn't the only possible source of extremely dangerous ideology. So this whole thing with Žižek trying to offer an alternative counter to political correctness that could come from the left reminds me of a New York Times article I read about the famous author Yuval Noah Harari a while back. Of course, he's the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus. So, I'll just read a little bit. He worries that Silicon Valley is undermining democracy and ushering in a dystopian hellscape in which voting is obsolete. He worries that by creating powerful influence machines to control billions of minds, the big tech companies are destroying the idea of a sovereign individual with free will. Now, the interesting and very creepy thing in this article is that he talks about how he's a massive critic of these Silicon Valley tech giants, and he sees them as probably the worst threat to the survival of like humanity as we know it. And yet, when he goes on his book tour, he finds he's greeted with open arms and intense admiration by all the people in Silicon Valley. The CEOs are inviting him to dinner parties and speaking gigs. And what he said is, and this is the disturbing part, is he's like, well, if I'm really supposed to be criticizing these people and trying to wake people up to the problem, then why is it that they love me so much? Is it that in some fundamental way I'm not really a threat to them and I'm just kind of like a dinner party curiosity or something like that? And earlier we saw Žižek on Madame Kathy Newman's program on BBC, and you might be surprised to know that he was received incredibly warmly. She did give him a little bit of pushback on some things, but overall she was extremely cordial with him, and he got all the time that he needed to say what it is that he wanted to say. And you see the same thing with a lot of other platforms. He's allowed, he's very welcome on Vice, The Guardian, and although he does get some pushback here and there, he is extremely popular basically all over the left-wing side of the internet. So it really seems to me that he's kind of relegated, at least with regards to his criticisms of political correctness, to this kind of like strange sidelined dinner party curiosity or variety adding gadfly sort of position. But because of the way he's received, that he doesn't actually present any kind of like real threat to the politically correct establishment. But if you are actually genuinely worried about this growing authoritarian sort of social justice warrior progressive ideology, then I guess from the reactions we're seeing, we know it's definitely the case that there are people who are being perceived as a genuine threat. Of course, Jordan Peterson being chiefly among those. Now, I don't really know why it is that Žižek isn't doing that, except that it seems to indicate to me that, he's not really offering a very genuine, serious alternative way of countering political correctness in my mind. Now, this is kind of an open-ended thing for me. I really wanted to share just like the fact that Žižek obviously has these opinions on this stuff, but as far as what to make of the situation, I'm still not that settled on it. So definitely, if anybody has any ideas of their own, please add a comment about it. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in more content, I'll be putting out more in the coming weeks and months, so definitely hit the subscribe button, and thanks a lot for watching. Take care.
But really, and what are you Russians? Normal fuck what?
Hentai.
What is hentai? I'm so
Hentai
stupid.
is Japanese cartoons, basically.
You see what I mean with these old baby boomer Marxists? You haven't heard of hentai before? Yeah.
You want to have sex with dogs, triple sex, trigender, you do whatever you want.